Howdy my totally as always Tubular gamers, we're back with, you guessed it, another video, and today it's going to be a little different. Today we're actually going to be talking negatively about some games. I know usually I keep things pretty positive in here, I talk about the best, this and that, not today. Today we're going to be talking about the worst zombie games. I thought for month of spooky I would talk about the best zombie games, but before I talk about the best zombie games, I gotta talk about the worst. There is no good without bad, and these ones are some real stinkers. Throughout the years there have been plenty of amazing zombie games, but there's also been some real shit. Now, I have not played every single zombie game in existence. I have played a shit ton of video games, but not all of them, and so these are just the 10 worst that I personally have experience with. So if there's something missing, you can let me know down below. There's just a good chance I didn't play it. This list will be going from, I guess, least bad to most bad. As the video progresses, the games are going to get worse and worse is what I'm saying, but I'll just immediately put it out there that I don't recommend a single one of these games. I think they're all bad, and there are so many better zombie games that you could actually play. So this intro's gone on long enough as is. Please like, share, comment, subscribe. I got the Patreon and the super thanks. Any support is truly greatly appreciated. Seriously, thank you all so very much, especially right now. Let's get into it. What's the 10th worst zombie game that I've ever played? Kicking things off, we have Plants vs. Zombies Battle for Neighborville. Now, I love the Plants vs. Zombies series. That original game is just kind of goated, one of the best zombie games ever, and the Garden Warfare games are actually pretty good. They're incredibly underrated. This game is like the follow-up to the Garden Warfare games, and unfortunately, it just misses the mark in basically every aspect. Outside of the presentation, which, yes, does look better than Garden Warfare 2, there is no reason to play this over either of the Garden Warfare games. While this game isn't a complete train wreck dumpster fire like some of the other games on this list, it still isn't very good. Like the Garden Warfare games, it is a team-based third-person shooter with one side being the plants and the other the zombies, and it is very much multiplayer focused. EA even marketed this game as like a live service, and everybody just collectively groaned and rolled their eyes. Yeah, it basically is a live service game for kids, since that probably is the target demographic, and as a live service, it's not doing so well. There is a single player, but like the Garden Warfare games, it's just not very good. It's even worse in this game. It's just extremely repetitive and kinda dull. Speaking of dull, we have the overall gameplay. While a bunch of the classes and gunplay returns from the previous games, it's such a step back in every aspect. The shooting somehow doesn't feel as nice, the classes don't feel as unique. They've actually changed up a bunch of them and they're no longer as distinct. They feel more homogenized, the variants are gone, the customization isn't as good, the maps are nowhere near as well designed, they don't work for a lot of these game modes, and I just don't think these matches flow as well as either Garden Warfare did. The game does introduce a few new ideas and it does have a few new classes, but I could really take them or leave them. I don't think they really added much here. The game is also very aggressive with its microtransactions. Don't get it twisted. Garden Warfare 1 and 2, as much as I like those games, they're pretty aggressive with their microtransactions. This though, this is way more than those other ones. I just didn't really have fun with this game, and I couldn't see myself going back to it or putting hours and hours and hours into it like I did with the Garden Warfare games, and it's a real shame because this was supposed to be the follow-up to Garden Warfare 2, and it just made everyone go back to Garden Warfare 2. I'm sure there are more people playing Garden Warfare 2 than this game because, you know, it's actually good. Maybe in the future we'll get another Garden Warfare. I just hope we get another Plants vs. Zombies one day because this still is the latest game, and yeah, it sucks. And so here we have a game I'm sure everybody loves to hear about, and that is Metal Gear Survive. Now, we could be here all day talking about Konami, Hideo Kojima, and what happened to the Metal Gear series, but I'll skip all of that and just give you the rundown of this game. It takes place in a non-canon world, alternate dimension or something, where this soldier gets taken from Metal Gear Solid 5 and put into, yeah, a different world where there's zombies, and they're just trying to figure out what the hell is even happening. And when it comes to the story, yeah, it's really basic, it's undercooked, and there's just not a lot going on here, and for a Metal Gear game, that's pretty upsetting. And rather upsetting is a great way to describe Metal Gear Survive. This game has the Metal Gear name to it. There's a certain level of quality that you expect when you play one of these games. There's really not any bad Metal Gear games, and then Metal Gear Survive shows up. If you want to compare this to any of the other Metal Gear games, it just completely falls apart. It's nothing like them at all, and it's not even good. It's not a stealth game. That would actually be kind of interesting. It is a generic survival game that really doesn't do anything different from the myriad of survival games that have come out over the last 15 years. You have to manage a bunch of resources, including your oxygen, food, water, health, etc. You can build up an entire base and actually create something that looks half decent, but a majority of the game is going to be you fighting these zombies, and yeah, it's just not the most exciting. You can actually play with other players, but you think I could convince somebody else to play this with me? Yeah, fat chance. Look, this game isn't like inherently terrible. It's not one of the worst games ever made, but it doesn't really excel at anything either. It's just a really mediocre, shallow experience that I found just incredibly dull. The fact that it has the Metal Gear name on it really just upsets me even more. If it didn't have the Metal Gear name on it, I probably would have just written it off as like this mediocre survival game. But let's focus on what we actually have here. A shallow, bland, generic survival game that really has no business belonging in the Metal Gear series. I've certainly played worse zombie games. I mean, you'll get to see them on this list, but I've played so many better ones that this game, it's better left forgotten. And so here we have a game I've just never really liked, and that is Shell Shock 2 Blood Trails. Now this game was actually developed by Rebellion, who went on to make the awesome Sniper Elite franchise. They've actually made some pretty good games, so it's clear they were just having an off day when they made this one, or well, several off days while they were making this one. And that's because this isn't a very good game. This is easily one of the worst first-person shooters from the PS3 360 era, and it's a buggy, broken mess of a game. It actually takes place during the Vietnam War. It's one of the rare games that takes place during that war. It sees you playing as a soldier, fighting the Viet Cong, and then all of a sudden fucking zombies show up. The plot really is as stupid as it sounds. It doesn't even feel like they try to link things together. It's just ridiculous. When it comes to the gameplay, ridiculous is a great way to describe it. It is a first-person shooter where you go and kill zombies and do a few set pieces. Unfortunately, it just doesn't come together in any meaningful way. The guns feel terrible, the movement feels terrible, the AI is just shockingly bad. It feels like they actually tried to replicate the zombies' intelligence when making the AI. Like, it is ridiculously terrible in this game. The level design and the set pieces really just don't do anything interesting, and what you're left with here is like a 3 to 4 hour FPS campaign that's incredibly forgettable, generic, dull, by the numbers, and ultimately just bad. Sure, it is nice that it doesn't go on for hours and hours and hours, but it just was not an enjoyable experience. While there is a little bit of entertainment to be had with this game since it is just so ridiculously stupid, and at times it can border on it's so bad it's good, for the most part it really is just bad. The story's nonsensical, the presentation is just kinda awful, and I remember on the console versions the frame rate was pretty terrible. It doesn't feel nice, it doesn't control well, and you know what? It's just not a very good experience. And here we have Evil Dead Hail to the King. Now this game came out in 2000 and it was developed by Heavy Iron Studios, who made SpongeBob Battle for Bikini Bottom and the movie game, and so you would expect there to be some quality here, but unfortunately you would be wrong. Now I love the Evil Dead series, I love the movies, I like the TV show, and there's even a few decent Evil Dead games. And then we have this game. So it takes place after Army of Darkness and sees Ash returning to his job at S-Mart, and he's really just trying to live a normal life, but he gets some horrific visions of the Necronomicon, and some shit happens, and evil doppelganger of Ash shows up, and yeah, evil is back. While the premise isn't the worst thing in the world, when it comes to the gameplay, that really is where this game just completely falls apart. It tries to be like the older Resident Evils, complete with fixed camera angles, pre-rendered backgrounds, and very clunky combat. This game came out in 2000 though. It was up against like Resident Evil Code Veronica, and it just completely falls apart when you compare it to that game. This game doesn't really do any aspect of its gameplay very well. The combat really is as awkward as it looks, like you just never get a good handle on it, the enemies are jumping all over the place, and it was just never exciting, engaging, and I just kind of wanted it to end. It's better to just avoid the zombies. When it comes to the survival elements, this game is all over the place. The balancing is absolutely terrible. They just do not give you enough resources for like anything. They barely give you any ammunition for the boomstick or gas for the chainsaw. You basically have to save everything for the bosses or you'll be locked out of beating the game. And hey, I get it, that's a staple of survival horror games, really managing your resources, but here it's just cranked up to such a ridiculous level that forget managing the resources, you literally just can't spend any of the resources on anything but the bosses. If you think Code Veronica's stingy with the resources, you haven't seen nothing, and the combat's so terrible you might end up accidentally wasting resources on enemies or the bosses, and it's just incredibly frustrating. The puzzles are also nothing to write home about, the level design is just more frustrating than annoying. This game, it looks like ass. It's super blurry, you can't tell what's background and what's not, you'll be pixel hunting. And when I was done with this game, I stood up, I went and touched some grass and just went, that really was one of the worst survival horror games I've ever played, and so it's one of the worst zombie games I've ever played. And it's a shame it's tied to the Evil Dead franchise. But hey, there actually is some good Evil Dead games. It's not all doom and gloom here. Really, almost every Evil Dead game is actually better than this one. This one is just the odd one out. And so here's a game I've always had beef with, and that's Resident Evil Survivor, released for the PS1. So for the unfamiliar, this is a light gun shooter set in the Resident Evil series. Capcom would actually have a few light gun shooters, and I'll just say they're all way better than this original one. So despite being a light gun shooter, you know, where you have the physical gun like House of the Dead, the North American version of this game does not support the light gun. Where do I live? I live in North America, so yeah, I get to play with the shitty controller. Why doesn't it support the light gun? Apparently they took it out because of Columbine, which frankly seems a bit ridiculous, like a little blown out of proportion. They probably wouldn't do that nowadays, and I'll be real, it's fucking sickening how many school shootings happen on the regular here in America. It really is sickening. Now, to steer the conversation back towards games, you know what else is sickening? Resident Evil Survivor. I have just never ever liked this game. Playing it without the light gun is just a miserable experience. This game just feels like an absolute chore to play. It really is one of the worst light gun shooters I've ever played. How do you mess up a light gun shooter? Like, honestly, all you do is shoot basically everything that moves and the game moves you along a track. Well, here's how you mess it up. You actually aren't on a track in this game. You can freely move around and even interact with the environment. They want you to solve basic puzzles in a light gun shooter. You kidding me? Aiming and shooting just feels absolutely horrible in this game. It's slow, it's clunky, it's imprecise, it's inaccurate, and it just doesn't really work with this game. Like, this game was clearly not designed for a controller, and there have been good light gun games with a controller. House of the Dead 3 on Xbox, it's actually pretty good with a controller. This game though, no, it's just awful playing with the controller. But setting aside the aiming and the shooting, you have a very mediocre standard light gun shooter. It's incredibly linear, you shoot up some Resident Evil enemies, and that's pretty much it. The game's about an hour and a half, and the entire time I was just kind of waiting for it to end. From a presentation standpoint, it's not very good either. This came out in 2000, it certainly does not look like it, and the load times are just way too long for this game. It just has an abundance of issues to be anything close to enjoyable, and you could always go, well, just play one of the versions where you can use the light gun. Yeah, I could, but is this game really going to be all that much better? It seems like a pretty mediocre, subpar light gun shooter regardless, and either way, it really is one of the worst zombie games of all time. I was trying to limit it down to just one Resident Evil game for this list. I actually had a few Resident Evil games. It came down to this and Operation Raccoon Shitty, and to be honest, I'd rather play Operation Raccoon Shitty than this. They at least got aiming right in that one. This game just sucks. So here we have a game I've actually talked about before, and that is Escape Dead Island. Now, I remember when this game was announced and subsequently released, it got blasted by just about everybody, but for some reason, this dumbass over here named Jonathan decided to go spend his hard-earned money and play it. And then for last year's Dead Island ranking video, I actually played through this game again, and you know what? It still is terrible. The game takes place before Dead Island 1, and it really sets up the events that happen in Dead Island 1, and while that might sound interesting on paper, this game has just an absolutely atrocious story. The writing's awful, the characters are wildly unlikable. Their motivations and purpose are just like the definition of unclear and unwise. The story is just somehow worse than Dead Island 1's story, which was already bad. It's boring, unimaginative, generic, bland, all those negative connotations. That's this game's story, and when it comes to playing this game, it really isn't any better. The game is a third-person action-adventure game where it tries to have a lot of moving parts. Unfortunately, those parts are all stuck in the mud and not actually going anywhere. Most of the game is combat. You're getting into combat with humans, zombies, sometimes some other creatures. Doesn't really matter. It's all not very good. A lot of it is melee-focused, where you'll pick up a melee weapon and start swinging it at a zombie. There's even stamina, but this game has the opposite of depth. You literally just press one button over and over, the zombies die. You do get into some firefights. There is some third-person shooting, and yeah, the aiming and shooting just feels terrible. The combat, it's not good. There is some stealth elements here, and yeah, it's as bad as you would expect. Surprisingly, there's no RPG aspects to this game whatsoever. Interesting choice. But outside of the combat, you'll be exploring these environments, you'll be investigating areas, taking pictures, and doing a lot of backtracking. There's like a surprising amount of backtracking in this game. They try to make it more like a Metroidvania in its design, but it's just so poorly designed, and the pacing is just so terrible that no, this is not a Metroidvania. It's just poorly designed. There's way too much backtracking for such a short game. This game is under 4 hours long, and you spend half of it just going back and forth between the same few areas. The game's presentation is certainly nothing to write home about. The game has an improper conclusion, and it's no wonder why pretty much everybody forgot this game exists. It's actually developed by Fat Shark, who would go on to make Warhammer Vermintide 1 and 2 and Darktide, so I guess humble beginnings, right? Regardless, it's a terrible zombie game, and even for the Dead Island series, this is pretty awful. So here we got another shite game silly goofy Jonathan decided to buy with his hard-earned money in high school that turned out to be ass. You know, I was a huge fan of The Walking Dead in the 2010s. I love the Telltale games. I like the show. The comics are cool. I saw this game and went, wow, this could be really cool. It's about Daryl. He's like my favorite character. It's going to be a survival game. It's going to be a first-person shooter. This really could be actually good. And then I got it, played through it in like 4 or 5 hours and went, I really just spent a bunch of money on this, and that feeling of disappointment and disgust with myself really has not left me. This game just flat out sucks. It's one of the worst zombie games of them all, and it's just one of the worst first-person shooters I've ever played. So the game is based off of the Walking Dead TV show. It's actually a prequel. It's about Merle and Daryl just trying to get to wherever the hell it is that they're going. Zombies show up, bullshit ensues, it's typical Walking Dead shit. This plot is nothing to write home about. Yeah, the actors do reprise their roles, but it sure doesn't feel like it. This is like the definition of phoning it in. And I could say the same about the story. Nothing happens. Like, nothing really could happen since it's a prequel. They could have introduced some new characters or tried to do something, but no. We don't get anything. This story's a waste of time. And the gameplay, pretty much the same thing. It is a very mediocre, under average, half-baked first-person shooter with some very, and I mean very basic survival elements. If you thought Metal Gear Survive was a bad survival game or had shitty survival elements, this game, it's much worse. There's like nothing you actually even really have to manage. You get to manage like your gas, and that's really it, and it's so easy to find some anyway. Like, the entire survival mechanics are just a complete waste. There's nothing here. And when it comes to the actual action, you know, the first-person shooter action, or when you have your knife and you're silently killing zombies, it's terrible. The guns feel terrible. The game feels like you're constantly underwater. It has a terrible feel in general. Fighting the walkers really sucks. It's just unengaging. It's not fun. A lot of the times you just get grabbed by these fuckers and you just gotta stab them in the head, and then you get this whole chain reaction where you're just stabbing them over and over and over. This isn't fun. This isn't interesting. This is dull. The areas you go to are very dully designed. They're just flat and basic. There's really nothing going on here. There's not any set pieces, or at least any good ones. There's no memorable moments, and the whole game just kind of feels like a blur. Like, all of it blends into itself. The environments and the graphics in general are just super dull and not very good in the slightest. The game does not take advantage of the Walking Dead license like at all. The game's mad short, and there's no reason to ever go back to it, but you know what? I couldn't take another minute of this game. I was just so let down. I don't even know why I was so excited for this. I think there was just a lot of hype behind The Walking Dead at the time. Looking back, I should have known this was going to be shite. The game has been delisted, and honestly, you're not missing anything. It truly is one of the worst zombie games I've ever played. Well, I said I only wanted one Resident Evil game on this list, but I just had to include this second one, and that's Umbrella Corps. Umbrella Corps, we could probably do a whole video essay on how this game is just one of the worst games that I've ever played. but I'm going to keep things brief, especially since this is not a Resident Evil specific video. This game is just awful in basically every single metric imaginable. The presentation is terrible, the idea is terrible, it's horribly executed, the shooting sucks, the zombies are mindless, there's nobody playing the always online multiplayer game, and the single player is just downright atrocious. It really is a rotten experience through and through. It sees you playing as Hunk and all of his dudes, and you do the most basic of multiplayer objectives. Despite being a multiplayer game, this game was more dead than all of the zombies, literally like the day it released. There has been nobody playing this game even a week later, and so you're stuck with just this awful single player experience where it really is just boring as shit. Like, the shooting sucks, fighting the zombies is lame, you don't really do anything. Like, it's even more basic than playing a multiplayer game with bots. It's basically just playing by yourself. These single player missions are just an absolute joke. The game really has nothing good about it, and it's one of the worst things Capcom has ever put out. It's probably the worst game they've ever put out, legit, and there's just nothing redeemable about it. But somehow it's only number 3. And that's because that game's actually still playable, unlike this game, Infestation: The New Beginning. So this game has had a few different names throughout the years. The first name was the warz, then Infestation Survivor Stories, and I guess at some point it became Infestation: A New Beginning. It doesn't really matter what this game's name is, it's a pile of shit. I'm pretty sure this is actually like the lowest rated MMO of all time. I say MMO, but I would never call this game an MMO. So this game was created to cash in on the Dayz craze. If you don't remember, like a little over 10 years ago, tons of survival games popped up, kind of copying what Dayz did, and this was the most infamous example of it. An early access buggy dumpster fire of a game dropped into Steam early access, hoping that some people would move to this from Dayz, and I can tell you, yeah, nobody moved to this game. Everybody immediately saw that this game, it really was a pile of crap. It was incredibly buggy, very unfinished, it barely worked, almost nobody was playing it immediately, and it didn't have an original bone in its body. It also didn't do anything remotely well or unique either. Everything just didn't work. From the shooting to the survival mechanics to the building mechanics, literally just nothing came together in this game. And I remember trying it back when it was called the warz and going, wow, this really is as bad as everyone said it was. It was really cheap, like under $5. I thought I'd mess around with my friends in it, and it was just absolutely atrocious. Nowadays, the game has been renamed twice, and it really doesn't have anybody playing it. It's just a husk of a game. That's why I'm using footage that isn't mine, because you really can't get any footage of this game since nothing actually happens in it if you're not playing with anyone else. And it's even gone free to play, so it's just like, yeah, nobody gives a shit about this game. It was shit then, it's shit now, it's going to be shit forever. But hey, at least you can open the exe file of that game. Yep, we're really scraping the bottom of the barrel. Here we have the Day Before, which I believe to be the worst zombie game ever. And not just the worst zombie game, one of the very worst video games ever released and subsequently unreleased. This game is just an absolute joke. It was only around for like a month or two before getting delisted, eventually pulled from Steam entirely. Like, you can't buy it anymore, you can't play it anymore, it's been shut down. A lot of people called it the scam before, and yeah, that's what I would call it also. The game was hyped up to be this next-gen open-world zombie survival game. It was gonna move survival games forward. It looked incredible, and at one point it really was the most wish-listed game on Steam, period. But it turns out it was all hype and there was nothing actually here. What we ended up getting was just a complete garbage can fire. There was nothing actually here. The game looked like shit, it ran like shit, the gameplay was almost non-existent, the shooting was terrible, there were bugs everywhere. Almost nothing actually happens in this game. You just wandered a bunch. The zombies are awful. Another player could show up sometimes, but you know what? There was just nothing really going on with this game. It was just really a fake game through and through. All the trailers, all the gameplay demos that they showed of this game were fake. That's not what the actual game was at all. What we actually got was just nothing even remotely close to it, and then yeah, everybody got mad at them. Game was immediately super panned, and I guess they just ran out of money and just shut the whole game down. And so it's just legit completely unplayable now. At least with Infestation, you know, you can get to the main menu. I don't even know if you could do that for this game anymore. I, like everybody else, refunded the game when I saw that it was an absolute dumpster fire. and this game is easily going to go down as one of the worst pieces of media ever released. Another human released this to a human and expected them to buy it. Yeah, right. I do not think history will be kind to The Day Before, and neither will I. It's an awful piece of shit that wasn't worth your time when it was available, and now it's not even available. And I really don't got anything left to say about it. And so that's it for this video. These were the 10 worst zombie games that I've experienced with. I hope you all enjoyed it. If you made it to this part of the video, comment brains, as in zombies gonna eat them brains. And I'll see you all next time. Bye bye now.